It's because you clicked it so much.
And we're off. I know. Okay, now it's fine.
All right, so welcome everyone. The topic that I'm presenting on today is Touch in the cloud, using Amazon Web Services with Touch to use the cloud infrastructure in some way to get your data out into the internet and then back into Touch. And I want to start by saying it's less of a lesson and more of thinking out loud about an idea that I've been messing around with and prototyping. So I don't really have a good technique to take home from this to start using in your own projects yet, but it's a starting point. So for anyone who's not familiar with Amazon Web Services, Amazon, the company that has the big e-commerce website where you can buy things and have it delivered to your door, is bankrolls this web infrastructure, data farm, software as a service, Internet of Things, super hub of these big data centers where they run all of this cloud-hosted stuff for their customers. So typically, if you wanted to have, in the past, if you wanted to have something existing on the web, you would have to run your own web server as a machine plugged in a data center plugged to the internet, and you'd be responsible for maintaining the software and the hardware of that server and configuring everything to make sure it all works with the application that you're developing. With this model, everything's broken down into microservices that communicate with each other and don't necessarily exist on one machine in one data center. So when things are spread in this way, broken down into microservices and individual processes, you can do things like have your data redundant along different regional points around the continent or around the world. You can have load balancers, so if your application's receiving a lot of requests, it can divert the requests to different redundant data sources to handle those requests. And the other benefit is, because it's all managed, you as the person using the system to build your application are not responsible for all of the underlying maintenance of upgrading dependencies and versions and running Linux operating systems to run this stuff. So I've been doing some work on this recently for some other web clients, and I had the idea to see if I could leverage some of the cloud benefits in Touch. And the way that I do that, basic example, was to build a system that can grab the parameters of an operator that you've configured to look a certain way, store it as a preset, but instead of storing it as a preset locally, packaging that data into an API request and sending it off to Amazon and having it appear in your database here. So there's a few things that make this possible. There's a few ingredients to make this happen. The first is I've built this little component that has an extension inside it that will look at the parameters that you've set on the config page to find out which operators you're working with. Can anyone read any of this, by the way? It's
Not really. Maybe you can change your DPI state.
Sure. How do I do that? Is that better?
Yeah.
Bigger again?
Let's try.
Okay, cool.
Now we can see. Yeah.
So this component takes a target, and that target in this case is this graphic effect operator that I just dragged in from the palette. And the target is in this function, it just iterates over the custom parameters on that to grab a dictionary of the parameters. And it encodes them as JSON. So JSON is JavaScript object notation, for anyone who doesn't know. It's a really common interchange format to get data from one application sent to another over the internet, or for storing configuration files for software. So that gets put somewhere. So there's also a payload dat that is a parameter of this little component. And the payload dat is where the information that gets scraped from the component that you're trying to store a preset from gets put. That feeds into this web comp. The web comp I just pulled from the TouchDesigner forums. It's basically a component with a big extension. I can't see anything now, it's so small. A big extension class in here that handles thread-safe web requests to APIs. So this uses Python, the Python requests module, and a bunch of custom code to take your payload and send it to the URL that you put in here via the request type that you specified. So this is making a post HTTP request to this endpoint, and this endpoint is hosted with Amazon AWS. So on the touch side, it's simple. It's just getting data and moving it to somewhere and getting a component to reference that somewhere and send it off. The confusing and difficult part about this is actually setting up your cloud-hosted API, your infrastructure. So the way that typically works is you set up an account with Amazon Web Services, and then you go through the individual services to make up the web-hosted application that you need. So this application needs an API gateway, something to handle the incoming HTTP requests from TouchDesigner and decide what to do with them. And that itself calls another API which invokes the methods to put items into this database. So the database is a NoSQL implementation called DynamoDB. It's a really simple key value pair storage where you can send it basically something that matches this key. If you put test against the key of component, that will go into that column for you for that request. The API gateway is this big, complicated web GUI that you have to learn how to use to make your API do what you want and to handle the data the way you want. But if anyone's interested in this, I've done something to make that a lot easier, so you don't have to go through and follow a tutorial to click and set up all of these components to work the way that you want. What you can do is use this template component that I've got here. And what this does is it reads off the hard drive some base templates to get you started, and you pass it a DAT, and it'll look at the keys that you set in this DAT and the data types, and it'll spit out a template for you that will provision your API gateway and your database on Amazon Web Services, and spit out the URL that you need to put into the web component to post your data to, as well as your API keys so that you can secure it so that nobody else can find that web address and start getting data into your database. So the way this works is, you know what? I'm gonna be brave, and I'm gonna delete the one that I've got and test this and make sure it works. So this component takes these templates off disk. The templates are probably not something you'd want to mess with. It's a big long description of all of the components that make up your application. And a service called Amazon CloudFormation reads this template and figures out which of these services depend on each other in which order and how to deploy them so that your application is portable. So you could make one of these templates, give them to someone else, and have them deploy a version of your application within their own cloud space. So the way that you do that is upload your template. So when I hit compile here, it goes through, looks at this table and says, I want to create a database with columns, name, component, and parameters, and I want my API to interpret posts with those keys and put them into those columns. And then, because I haven't really made this very ergonomic, I still have to come here and hit write. I should have scripted that. Then you can upload your new template, which will be template 0. You know what, I don't know if it is, I don't believe it's that one. I'm going to delete all these other ones first. Compile. Right. And there's my new template. And I'll upload that here. With a bit more finesse, you could actually install the Amazon command line interface Python extension, and you could automate all of this through system calls through the system Python or the shell from Touch. But for now, I'm just doing it through the web GUI. So this is Amazon CloudFormation reading the template and going through and automatically deploying all of the microservices that interact with each other to create this cloud application. And it usually only takes about a minute. And you can see the progress of the individual things happening here. So it's created my database table, the database user. What else? The user role that can access the API in the database. And now you can see it's actually built the API gateway. It's assigned the API key for me to use and a usage plan for that API key. So if you wanted to, you could have an application where you develop, you generate a whole bunch of API keys and you assign those keys to usage plans. So you could have custom software that hits these APIs and you can limit the amount of access to these things if you had a big distributed system that was running in Touch for the end users, for example. So that's complete, and it will show me the resources that it's built here. So the first thing I need to do is get my new API key. And stick that into Touch. I've just got in this table. And that API key is fed to my web comps, one for sending data to the database and one for querying data from it, which I'll show you in a bit. The next thing I need to do is see the new endpoint for the API. So if instead of destroying that stack that I had previously built, I chose to update it, because you can make changes to your templates and then deploy them again, and it's smart enough to go through and only update the things that you've made changes to without destroying your data. So if you adjust your API gateway and you redeploy, it'll go and rebuild those services for you without losing any of the data that you've already sent. But in this case, I didn't do that, so it's generated a new ID, a new unique ID that my API lives behind. So I need to copy that and put it into my components that are hitting the API. Which, given a bit more time, could all be scripted and not have any errors. Cool. So if everything worked, I should now be able to dial in some parameters on this component to get a cool look. It's cool enough. Give it a name. Store it. And this is a little bug with the web comp that I haven't figured out yet, where sometimes it doesn't work the first time. Cool. So you can see the console printed out this new row ID, and that's the response after it's made the API call. The item's been put into the database, and the database returns the unique ID for the row that you've just created. And if I come into my web overview of my database tables, I can see this is a new table that CloudFormation built for me when I deployed the template. And inside here is my new preset one that I've just sent off. So the next part of the equation is recalling the presets from the cloud and using them in Touch to change presets. I'm just going to store another one just so we can see the change. To make it crazy. Cool. Well, it's a bit too crazy. It's just white. That'll do. So we'll call this presets 2, store it, see that it gets sent off. You can see it appear here in our database. And with any luck, we'll be able to retrieve it. So there's another page. Oh, I haven't done that yet. How was I doing it before? Yeah. Let's move this over here so we can see. Just a moment. That's the old data. So I'm going to cheat and just call the API here. I can't remember where I scripted the actual retrieve method, but this should, it did, it updated the table. Just to demonstrate that again. So this table is the response. It's where the response from hitting the API to query presets for the feedback edge component. It's where the data goes. So when I hit go, they should drop into this table, and they do. So if you had multiple different types of data in the one table and you had them keyed by the component that they're relevant to, what I've built is an API that when you hit table and then the name of the component, it returns the table data for that component. So if I hit this again, now that I've changed that name in the database, it should only return the one. But for our purpose, we want two to be able to show that we can change between them. Shit. So I'm going to do that. Hit the server again. And now, I'll just close this off because it is very tight. So now this is just a really simple changer between the presets that are in this table. Obviously, it would make more sense to write a much smarter class for handling these things and being able to queue and interpolate. But for now, I'm just selecting rows between these tables. And when I run this script, we should see the parameters on this operator all jump. So that is a very basic implementation of the idea of sending data off to the cloud, storing it and pulling it back and using it in a meaningful way. It's only the surface. You can also use a service called AWS Lambda, which replaces, extends this API template idea, but allows you to actually write Python code on the receiving end. So you could send a request from Touch to this Python function, do whatever with it, call other APIs, reference other data sources, process it, run it through OpenCV or a machine learning algorithm or something, and then store it in your database. And then you could query, or you could send it off to something else, anything else. You can use Amazon S3, which is a file storage service. So these web comps also support sending and retrieving binary data. So you can actually send and retrieve any type of file, images, movies. You could even save a component to an external TOX and send that off to a repository that you have set up with Amazon S3, and you could have other TouchDesigner instances running all over the world, polling that for updates and pulling down new components and inserting them into your network, however you like. So if anyone's interested, I'm happy to share this template system that I've built. It's pretty much plug and play. It should set up an API for you to store and simple table data. And this part takes a bit of learning to learn the template definitions for Amazon. And if you're not someone who's provisioned web services or web servers before, it's probably not worth getting into because it's a deep hole, but it's totally possible to template these things in Touch and have those templates automatically generated from template tables or components that you've got in Touch. Any questions? Yes?
Can you theoretically do this only with an FTP server? I mean, without having to access all this Amazon account?
You could, but then you would be managing this FTP server. So, and then you wouldn't have any of the benefits of data redundancy or automatic scaling. The Amazon Web Service and the Amazon Cloud, the whole idea behind it is that it's for huge, huge applications that need to, always work. And because it's fully managed, it's not just a server that you administer, but it's your application living in the cloud, and it has 100% uptime, and it's replicated so that you have really low latency responses no matter where you hit it in the world. I realize that it's a bit of overkill for something like this, and to use with Touch in general, especially, just storing, most of the stuff that you'd be doing with Touch you'd want to be storing locally anyway, but the cool ideas that I see using it for are things like distributing updates to installations in galleries.
Could you possibly also upload and retrieve movie files, for example?
Yeah. Yeah, that would be with Amazon S3, the file bucket service, and that actually has revisioning per file. So you could, then there's a query API for it. So if you want to select movie files that have been tagged with a certain tag, and you want to get the latest version of them, you can have your API gateway return all those for you, and you can pick the one you want. It's more than just FTPing a file. It's a whole API around getting and storing and organizing and retrieving and versioning your files. So it opens you up to a whole new level of data wrangling, I suppose.
And is there also a way to, because now we have to manually look for new files. So, and also, if I saw right, like it's writing the retrieving table, it's writing it all the time new. So is there any chance to get like just the updated files, for example, in the API, to just say, okay, I just want to have the new values?
Yeah, you certainly can do that. It would just take a little bit more work than what I've put into this. The query, you could have multiple API endpoints, one that just gives you everything in the table that matches the name of the component, like what I've done. Or you could be more fine-grained with that and be searching by other columns like tags or within the actual parameters of the operators themselves. So if you wanted to, you could find all of your effects that are more heavily read if you've got RGB values, for example. So you could really query, in the API template, in the response mapping template, you can really define what gets returned from your request. So in that way, you could just get results that are newer than what you've already got. Another question?
I think it's two questions.
Mm-hmm.
Is it possible to listen, to have like a push from Amazon to Touch,
Yes.
like a push notification?
Yes, I haven't used that for this case, but it's the same concept. You would add the service that handles that to your template. There's two services through Amazon that would fit that. One of them is heavily geared towards Internet of Things, sort of pushing and pulling and subscribing to topics and events for lots of devices with low latency and small streamed packets of information. And there's also Amazon Kinesis, which is for real-time streaming data, and it's geared towards doing data analytics for, like, I don't know, internet traffic, or maybe you've got some piece of custom software that's always recording sensor input, and you funnel that all through, and it's for doing big data analytics on that. But you can use those same protocols to stream data and have it as a connection that stays open with two-way communication using WebSockets or the other protocol that Touch also natively supports that I forget the name of until MQTT. So MQTT is a protocol specifically developed for low bandwidth sensors and things, for Internet of Things. But with both of those, you could have two-way communication. So if another piece of software, could be a TouchDesigner instance, or it could be a script on any software, makes a change on Amazon Cloud, that gets pushed out to everything else that's connected to it, and your clients respond in kind.
Perfect.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think the last question for me is, what's the price? Like, do they offer like a small free thing, or is it like a freemium program?
They do. There is the Amazon free tier. Pretty much every service that you want to start developing with and playing with is free, as long as your usage is under a certain amount. And this is the reason why Amazon is so good, because on top of that, you only ever pay for the actual compute resources that get used. So if you typically were maintaining your own FTP server, you'd be paying for that to be running all the time. And it's a machine in a data center that has its own hard drive and its own processor, and it's using its own power, etc., and that has to be on and running. Whereas with this, it's built so that it's just compute time on their cloud data center. So they have thousands of CPUs and thousands of hard disks and thousands of GPUs, etc. And anytime a request comes in, it gets put through to an open thread, and these resources are spun up. They're stateless. They're kind of generated. They process your request, send it off, and then they destroy. So, yeah, it's and you're billed like fractions of a cent per milliwatt or whatever it took to do that. I've been using this for 2 months now, developing with it pretty heavily for some web work that I've been doing for some clients. And I've so far been billed about 83 cents for two months of usage. Yeah.
So it's almost nice.
Until it's built to scale to have thousands and thousands of requests per minute. And yeah, so it's free if you're just using it for something small, but if you want to, host eBay on it and you have thousands of hits, then it gets more expensive. Yeah?
Is it possible somehow to stream like multiple outputs from TouchDesigner and then stream them back through multiple computers and separately?
Yeah, it depends on what you're streaming. Streaming video, you're probably better off just using streaming video protocols. You could build something on this to accept a video stream and then host it and have other people go to link to the stream.
No, sorry, for example, I'm thinking of a multiple projector installation and just by single out of hundreds of meters of cables. Just going in a server, like uploading your outputs somehow. Obviously, I'm not really good at networking, so
Yeah.
just like uploading your outputs and taking these outputs through from the network from this cloud into your PC.
You probably could, but for video, I would always want to keep it on the local network if you're going to be streaming video in one building. There's nothing that I've found in Amazon Web Services that seems geared towards hosting video streams. I mean, I haven't looked specifically for that purpose. You probably can. I don't know how to do it yet. I'm more excited about broadcasting chop data, real-time chop data at 60 frames per second or 60 hertz, hitting an AWS Lambda function that's a Python script that takes your chop data and sends it off to, you know, your multiple clients that are listening to it, and then you have it's like a touch chop in node, but it's coming from the internet instead of the local network.
How much delay would that have, or could that be fast?
Well, it could be. It'll never be instant, but the Amazon Web Services, most of them are meant to be less than 10 milliseconds of delay on not encountering for the network, for the internet requests, but pretty much everything that happens on the Amazon side is optimized for single digit latency. The database, for example, DynamoDB is extremely fast, and it's commonly used for storing states for MMORPG, like mobile games, where you've got hundreds of clients tapping on their mobile device, and their actions go off to this database and get sent off to someone else within a single digit of latency, so under 10 milliseconds. So it can be fast. I haven't figured out how to do the chop streaming yet, and if I do, I'll come back and show you how to do it, because I think that'd be really interesting to us. Cool. Any more questions?
If you just want to upload, like what you did, some preset or something, so not streaming, and you just want to have something on the cloud, could you use like Google Drive or some of these cloud storage and just put it in a file there and read from a file?
You certainly could.
Would that be easier then for just such a purpose?
Yes, and that would be what I'd recommend if you don't want to learn how to use CloudFormation and write these templates for provisioning cloud stuff.
But I see why you're doing it if you want to stream and you want to do this.
Yeah, I was just in.
It makes more sense using that. But if you just want to like store some or send updates or some, not maybe then it's easier to just read a file that's on some cloud service and then it's automatically backed up.
Definitely, if it's static data that's not being updated in a complex way in real time, then yeah, just having a remote file that you write to and having other clients pull it down is totally fine. But I'm trying to play with this and see what novel things I can build from it. For example, I was talking about this with Ivan from Derivative at the last meetup, and his idea was using it to prototype a voting system for taking. He wanted to have. He said we could have votes for new components to make it into the TouchDesigner palette, for example. So there'd be a little thing that pulls down from the TouchDesigner forums these new components, and you can upvote and downvote review things from within Touch and have that go off to a database. He also wants to prototype a radical democracy voting 2.0 type system with fancy graphics that he said he might prototype in Touch, but would ultimately end up being like a voting booth type thing. But that would require a massive infrastructure behind it to take everybody's ballots for voting for the president or whatever. Cool, that's all for me.
But I mean, you're basically working with this kind of stuff, so you can just dig yourself into that
Yeah.
for the sole purpose of TouchDesigner, right?
Yeah, just to see if I can make them work together. Thank you.